What if a single act of kindness could change an entire restaurant? Jason thought he knew everything about people. Rich folks got respect. Broke folks got ignored. That was just how the world worked. Until the night he humiliated an elderly woman at the counter and someone unexpected stepped in. The moment Shaquille O'Neal pulled out a $100 bill, the entire diner went silent. Jason smirked, pushing it back. Sorry, man, company policy. What happened next? The whole internet found out. And Jason? He learned the hardest lesson of his life. Because sometimes disrespect costs way more than you think. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret's fingers tremble as she digs through her purse, pulling out crumpled bills and loose coins. She counts them, then counts again, her lips moving silently as if willing the numbers to change. The line behind her grows restless. A sharp sigh echoes from the man behind her. Oh, come on, he grumbles. The diner is warm and lively, filled with the clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation. Waitresses in blue aprons glide between tables, balancing trays of steaming plates. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon lingers in the air. But Margaret isn't part of the warmth. She stands frozen at the counter, feeling small, invisible. The world around her moves at full speed, but she is stuck. Stuck counting, stuck hoping she has enough. Jason, the young cashier, leans against the register with an expression of impatience. His name tag, slightly crooked, catches the flickering fluorescent lights. He clicks his tongue, drumming his fingers against the counter. Margaret's heart sinks as she recounts her change. Still short. Jason smirks, tilting his head. Lady, you're short. You gonna pay or what? Margaret flinches. She hates this. Hates the humiliation burning her cheeks. I think I have a few more coins, she whispers, fumbling deeper into her purse. Jason rolls his eyes, exchanging a look with his coworker. Look, if you can't afford it, just say so. No need to waste everyone's time. A couple of chuckles ripple through the line. A woman behind her leans in and mutters, This is ridiculous. Margaret's fingers finally grasp a lone quarter at the bottom of her bag, but even as she places it on the counter, she knows it won't be enough. Jason scoffs, shaking his head. Still short. Her throat tightens. Can I maybe take off the toast? That should make it cheaper, right? Jason exhales dramatically and starts tapping at the screen. Lady, even if you take off half the meal, you're still not going to make it. Maybe try somewhere else. A silence hangs in the air. Margaret stares at the counter, her shoulders slumping. Behind her, someone mutters, Hurry it up. Some of us got places to be. The sting of tears pricks Margaret's eyes. She forces herself to nod. I'm sorry, she whispers, hands moving to push her tray aside. Before she can turn away, a deep, commanding voice rumbles from behind her. Nah, the voice says. Leave it all on the tray. The room seems to shift as heads turn toward the source. Jason's smirk falters. Margaret hesitates, peeking over her shoulder. A towering figure steps forward. His presence alone fills the space with authority. Shaquille O'Neal. Jason blinks, his confidence wavering. Who are you? Shaq doesn't break eye contact. How much? Jason stares at him, confused. What? Shaq points at Margaret's meal. How much? Jason glances at the register, suddenly aware that the entire diner is watching. $12.75, he mutters. Without a word, Shaq pulls out a crisp $100 bill and places it on the counter. The diner falls silent. Jason stares at the bill, his fingers twitching. Then slowly a smirk creeps onto his face. We don't take tips, he says. Margaret's eyes widen. Jason pushes the bill back toward Shaq. Shaq tilts his head, his expression unreadable. And just like that, the tension in the diner thickens. Margaret swallows hard. Jason just made a huge mistake. Margaret's hands shake as she reaches for her plate, fingers barely gripping the edges. The warmth of the food does little to ease the cold humiliation settling in her chest. She swallows hard, forcing herself to stay composed. Slowly, carefully, she removes a side of toast, setting it aside. Then, with a trembling hand, she slides a small fruit cup away. But it's not enough. Jason, the cashier, leans against the counter, arms crossed over his chest. His smirk grows as he watches her struggle. Lady, Jason sighs dramatically. If you can't afford it, just say so. A few chuckles ripple through the line behind her. Someone clears their throat impatiently. Margaret keeps her head down. I'm just trying to... Jason shakes his head, cutting her off. Look, maybe come back when you can actually pay for a meal. The words sting more than she expects. A knot forms in her throat as she pushes another item off the tray. She doesn't dare look up. The weight of everyone's eyes on her is unbearable. Behind her, a man mutters under his breath, Seriously? This is taking forever. Margaret's breath hitches. She nods, defeated. I'm sorry, she whispers, gripping the tray, ready to leave. Jason shrugs. Not my problem. Margaret turns away, her stomach twisting, not just from hunger, but from the realization that no one in the room cared. No one was going to help. Just as she takes a step back, a deep, commanding voice rolls through the diner like thunder. Nah, the voice says, steady and firm. Leave it all on the tray. The entire diner seems to freeze. Margaret stops mid-step, her heart pounding. The people behind her, once so eager to rush her away, suddenly grow quiet. Jason blinks, confused. What? Margaret, hesitant, slowly turns around, and then she sees him. A towering figure stands just a few feet away, his presence impossible to ignore. His broad shoulders stretch beneath a simple hoodie, hands casually resting in his pockets. Shaquille O'Neal. The room shifts, energy crackling in the air. Jason's smirk falters. Shaq steps forward, his gaze locked onto the young cashier. How much? Jason hesitates. What? Shaq jerks his chin toward Margaret's tray. Her meal. How much? Jason stares at him, his previous arrogance flickering into uncertainty. $12.75. Without a word, Shaq pulls out a crisp $100 bill and places it on the counter. The diner falls completely silent. Jason's fingers twitch as he looks at the bill. A slow, smug grin creeps onto his face. We don't take tips, he says, pushing the money back toward Shaq. Margaret's breath catches. Jason has no idea who he's messing with. Shaq tilts his head, his expression unreadable. You sure you want to handle it this way? The air in the diner shifts. Conversations stall. The clatter of silverware on plates fades. All eyes are drawn to the massive figure stepping forward, his sheer presence commanding attention. Shaquille O'Neal. Towering over the counter, his broad shoulders filling the space, Shaq fixes a steady gaze on Jason, the cocky young cashier. How much? Shaq's voice is calm but firm. Jason blinks, momentarily caught off guard. Then he lets out a short laugh. Man, why do you care? Shaq doesn't move, doesn't blink. His gaze is unwavering. How much? Jason glances at the register, suddenly uncomfortable under the weight of 100 eyes watching him. He hesitates, then clears his throat. $12.75. Without a word, Shaq reaches into his pocket, pulls out a crisp $100 bill, and slides it across the counter. The diner goes dead silent. Margaret, still frozen in place, looks up at Shaq, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jason stares at the money. The tension in the air thickens. A few customers lean in, eager to see what happens next. Jason's fingers twitch as if debating whether to take the bill. Then, that same smug smirk creeps back onto his face. We don't take tips, he says, pushing the $100 bill back across the counter. A sharp intake of breath ripples through the crowd. Margaret's stomach drops. Jason really has no idea who he's dealing with. Shaq tilts his head slightly, eyes narrowing. His expression is unreadable. You sure you want to handle it this way? He asks, his voice quieter now, but somehow more intense. Jason chuckles, leaning on the counter. Look, big guy, I don't make the rules. If she can't pay, she doesn't eat. Simple as that. A murmur spreads through the diner. Shaq exhales, his lips pressing into a thin line. His patience is running low. Margaret, her voice barely above a whisper, tries to step in. It's okay. I'll just... No, Shaq interrupts, his eyes never leaving Jason. It's not okay. Jason rolls his eyes. Look, man, she's not your problem. Shaq leans forward just a fraction. Everybody's my problem. A low murmur spreads across the diner. People exchange glances. The energy in the room has shifted. Jason's cocky expression falters for the first time. A waiter behind the counter suddenly gasps. His eyes dart between Shaq and the $100 bill on the counter. Then, in a hushed voice, he whispers, "Dude, do you know who that is?" Jason frowns. "What are you—" The waiter shakes his head, his voice urgent. "That's Shaquille O'Neal." Jason's smug grin vanishes. His Adam's apple bobs as he swallows hard. Shaq crosses his arms, waiting. The entire diner holds its breath. Jason swipes a nervous tongue over his lips, staring at Shaq like he's seeing him for the first time. For the first time all night, he doesn't have a comeback. Jason smirks as he slides the crisp $100 bill back across the counter. His fingers tap against it mockingly. "Sorry, man. Company policy." The words hang in the air, sharp and smug. The diner is silent, save for the faint clinking of utensils on plates. A few customers exchange looks. No one can believe what they just heard. Shaq's eyes stay locked on Jason, his expression unreadable. Margaret clutches her purse, her fingers gripping the strap tightly. She feels like a burden. She steps back, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay. I'll just leave." Shaq doesn't even glance at her. His attention remains fixed on Jason. "That how you treat people here?" His voice is calm, but there's an unmistakable edge to it. Jason rolls his eyes. "Look, man, I don't make the rules. She doesn't have enough. She doesn't eat." A low murmur spreads through the diner. A father sitting with his two kids shakes his head. An older man near the entrance mutters, "Disrespectful?" But Jason just shrugs, completely unfazed. Shaq takes a slow breath, his patience thinning. A teenage waitress, standing near the soda machine, whispers to her coworker, "He really doesn't know who he's messing with." Jason crosses his arms. "Look, if she can't pay, that's her problem, not mine." Shaq tilts his head slightly. "You ever been hungry before?" Jason lets out a short laugh. "No, I know how to handle my money." Shaq's eyes darken. "That's not what I asked." The smirk on Jason's face flickers. Shaq leans in just enough to make him uncomfortable. Not threatening, just powerful. "You ever been so hungry that your stomach feels like it's eating itself?" Jason shifts on his feet. He's still grinning, but it's forced now. Shaq nods to himself. "Yeah, thought so." Margaret tries to interject again, her voice trembling. "Sir, really, it's fine." Shaq raises a hand, silencing her. His gaze is still locked on Jason. "Listen, kid," Shaq says, voice low but firm. "You got two choices right now. You can take that money and do what's right, or—" Jason snorts, cutting him off. "Oh, I get it," he interrupts, smirking. "You think because you're big, I should just bend the rules for you." Shaq's jaw tightens. Jason shrugs, crossing his arms. "I treat people how they deserve to be treated." The room goes dead silent. A middle-aged woman near the back mutters, "Oh, he did not just say that." A few people shake their heads in disbelief. Shaq slowly unfolds his arms. His expression remains calm, but now there's something else there. Determination. Jason, still oblivious, chuckles. "What? You mad now?" Shaq exhales, shaking his head. "Nah." He picks up the $100 bill and stares at it for a moment. Then his lips curl into the slightest smirk. "You just made this a whole lot more interesting." The kitchen doors swing open with force, startling a few nearby customers. Kelly, the restaurant manager, steps out, her sharp eyes scanning the diner. She immediately notices the shift in the room, the tension so thick it feels like a weight pressing against the air. People are whispering, some staring at Jason, others stealing quick glances at Shaq. Kelly frowns, wiping her hands on her apron as she approaches the counter. "What's going on out here?" Jason barely spares her a glance. "Nothing, just handling a customer." Kelly's gaze flickers to Shaq, and her breath catches in her throat. Her eyes widen as she recognizes the towering figure standing calmly near the register. "Oh my God!" She rushes forward, her tone completely shifting. "Mr. O'Neal, I didn't realize you were here." Shaq, still composed, gestures toward Margaret. "Yeah, I'm here. And so is she," he says evenly. "She just wanted a meal. Your cashier made it a problem." Kelly blinks rapidly, looking at Margaret, then back at Jason. Jason, suddenly uncomfortable, shrugs. She didn't have enough money. Kelly's expression hardens. And? Jason scoffs. So what? You want me to just give her free food? The murmurs in the restaurant grow louder. A man near the back shakes his head in disbelief. A woman whispers to her husband, "Is this kid serious?" Kelly takes a slow, deep breath, her lips pressing into a firm line. She turns fully toward Jason, her voice icy. "Tell me this isn't true." Jason huffs, rolling his eyes. "She couldn't pay. That's not my fault." Kelly folds her arms, staring at Jason like she's trying to read his soul. "You mean to tell me," she says, her voice dangerously low, "that a legendary athlete who was standing right here willing to pay offered you money and you turned it down?" Jason fidgets, glancing at Shaq, then back at Kelly. His usual smug expression flickers with unease. I I was just following policy." Kelly tilts her head. "Right. And tell me, Jason, which page in our company handbook says to humiliate elderly customers and ignore acts of kindness?" Jason stammers. "I mean, she—" Kelly cuts him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Number, I've heard enough." Jason clenches his jaw, looking around the diner, desperate for support. But no one meets his eyes. The room has turned against him. The teenage waitress by the soda machine shakes her head in disgust. A father sitting with his two kids mutters, "This is embarrassing." Margaret, who has remained silent, shifts uncomfortably. "I really didn't mean to cause trouble." Kelly turns to her immediately, her expression softening. "No, Margaret, you didn't. He did." She jerks her head toward Jason. "And now he's going to deal with the consequences." Kelly straightens, her voice firm as she gestures toward the back office. "Jason, in my office. Now." Jason gawks at her, his confidence crumbling. "For what?" he snaps, his bravado cracking. Kelly's eyes flash. "For the stunt you just pulled. Now." Jason's fists clench at his sides. Shaq watches the entire exchange, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Jason turns back to Shaq, muttering under his breath, "This is bull—" Shaq's voice cuts through the diner like a blade. "Nah," he says, shaking his head. "This is what happens when you treat people like they don't matter." Jason swallows hard. For the first time that night, he has nothing to say. A woman seated in the corner leans toward her husband, whispering in disbelief, "Did that kid really just try to deny Shaq's money?" Her husband, still staring at Jason with a look of disgust, slowly shakes his head. Unreal. Near the entrance, a group of college students exchange glances before pulling out their phones. The quiet murmurs in the diner turn into full conversations, the atmosphere thick with shock. People don't just witness injustice anymore. They capture it. Within seconds, multiple customers are recording the scene. An elderly man sitting by the window mutters, "This is why customer service is dead." A younger woman standing in line scoffs, "Dude really thought he had power over Shaquille O'Neal?" The energy in the diner shifts. People aren't just shocked, they're angry. Jason, still standing at the register, feels the weight of dozens of eyes on him. His bravado from earlier? Gone. He glances nervously at the cameras now pointed at him. His expression hardens, but there's a flicker of something else. Panic. Meanwhile, Kelly rubs her temples, clearly frustrated beyond words. She turns back to Shaq, trying to salvage the situation. "Sir, I can't believe this happened," she says. "Please, Margaret's meal is on the house." Margaret, who has been clutching her purse like it's a lifeline, shakes her head. "I don't want free food," she murmurs. I just wanted to pay for my meal like everyone else." Her voice, small but steady, cuts through the noise. The customers watching, many of whom had ignored her earlier, now look at her with shame in their eyes. One man steps forward, pulling out his wallet. "I'll cover it," he offers. Another woman chimes in, "Me too." The momentum shifts. Where there was once silence and judgment, there is now solidarity. Shaq watches it all unfold, arms crossed. The tension, the realization, the silent understanding spreading through the crowd. Then finally, he speaks. "Nah," he says, raising a hand. "I got a better idea." Jason visibly swallows. Kelly lifts an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Shaq leans in slightly, a small, knowing smile forming. Let's make sure no one in here has to worry about their meal tonight. The diner erupts into murmurs of confusion. Jason frowns. Wait, what? Shaq pulls out his wallet, and that's when everything changes. Shaq takes a slow step back from the counter, then turns toward the entire restaurant. A hush falls over the diner, the only sounds coming from the faint sizzle of the grill and the occasional murmur of a confused customer. Nobody knows what he's about to do. Shaq slides his massive hands into the pocket of his hoodie and tilts his head slightly, scanning the faces around him. Some are watching in silence, others holding their phones up, recording. Then he speaks. How many people in here know what it's like to struggle? The question hangs in the air for a moment, thick with meaning. A few hands go up. A young father at a booth, sitting with his two kids, nods slowly. An older woman near the door, her coat patched at the elbows, raises her hand hesitantly. Even Margaret, still standing near the counter, presses her lips together and lifts a trembling hand. Shaq smiles gently, as if he already knew the answer. He reaches into his hoodie pocket and pulls out a thick folded stack of $100 bills. So thick it looks like a brick of generosity. The diner gasps. Jason's mouth falls open slightly. His arrogance from earlier? Completely gone. Shaq thumbs through the cash, then looks at Kelly, the manager. How much does it cost to keep this place running for the night? Kelly blinks. What? I mean, Shaq gestures around the room. What if we just covered everybody's meal? More gasps. A woman near the jukebox puts a hand over her chest. A teenager behind the counter nearly drops a tray of drinks. Shaq grins, eyes twinkling. Y'all cool with that? For a second, absolute silence. Then a roar of excitement. People cheer, clap, even laugh in disbelief. Wait, for real? One man shouts. A woman in the back shakes her head in shock. This can't be real life. Shaq chuckles. It's real. He extends the cash toward Kelly. The manager hesitates, glancing around. I don't even know what to say. Shaq winks. Say paid in full. The entire diner erupts into applause. Jason, standing behind the counter, watches in stunned silence. His face is unreadable, a mix of regret, shock, and something else. Margaret wipes her eyes, still gripping her small purse, as if she might wake up from a dream at any moment. The father at the booth pulls his kids closer, whispering something to them, maybe a lesson about kindness, maybe just a quiet thank you. Shaq turns back toward the counter and locks eyes with Jason. Now, Shaq says smoothly, what was that about people getting treated how they deserve? Jason swallows hard. For a split second, there's absolute silence, like the whole world just paused to process what Shaq had just done. Then, boom! The diner erupts into cheers. Customers clap, laugh, and even whistle, the energy shifting from tension to celebration in an instant. Margaret, still gripping her small purse, presses a trembling hand to her mouth. Her eyes glisten with tears. She looks up at Shaq, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't even know how to thank you. Shaq crouches slightly to meet her gaze, his towering presence suddenly gentle. Just enjoy your meal, Miss Margaret, he says with a warm smile. She nods quickly, wiping her eyes, still in disbelief. Behind her, a father at a booth claps, then turns to his two kids, whispering something to them. The little boy stares at Shaq with wide eyes, then tugs on his dad's sleeve. Daddy, is he a superhero? The father chuckles, ruffling his son's hair. Yeah, buddy, something like that. Shaq hears it, grins, and winks at the kid. Across the room, people stand up from their seats, reaching for Shaq, shaking his hand, patting his back. Man, you got a heart of gold. Shaq, you just made my night. This is what the world needs more of. The energy spreads like wildfire. Even the workers behind the counter seem caught up in it, except for one person. Through the glass window of the manager's office, Jason watches everything. His hands grip the edge of the desk, his confidence completely shattered. Just minutes ago, he thought he owned that counter, treating customers however he wanted. Now, he was watching a true example of power, but the right kind of power. Kelly, the manager, turns to him, arms crossed. You seeing this? Jason nods slowly, swallowing hard. His face is unreadable, a mix of regret, shock, and something deeper. Near the front, A woman grabs her phone and holds it up, recording. Her fingers fly across the screen. Tweet. Shaq just paid for everyone's meal after some rude cashier refused to serve a woman in need. Faith in humanity equals restored. She presses post. Another customer uploads a video to TikTok with the caption, Shaq proves why he's the GOAT. Kindness always wins. Watch this. Within minutes, notifications explode. 10,000 likes. 30K views. Trending. The comment section? Flooded. Shaq stays teaching life lessons. This is how you use your influence. Respect is free. Jason just learned that the hard way. Shaq, still handing out cash, suddenly feels his own phone vibrate. He pulls it out, glances at the screen, and chuckles. The video was already blowing up. He pockets his phone, then turns back to Jason, who's now standing at the door of the office. Shaq meets his eyes. Jason's shoulders slump. His lips press into a tight line. Shaq tilts his head slightly, like he's about to say something. But before he can speak, Kelly's phone rings loudly. She snatches it off the counter, checks the caller ID, and her face pales. She looks at Shaq, eyes wide. Shaq, you won't believe who's calling. Shaq squints at the bright screen of his phone as it buzzes relentlessly on the nightstand. It's barely 6 a.m., but his notifications are out of control. Hundreds of messages, dozens of missed calls. His social media is on fire. He blinks a few times, then groans, reaching for the phone. What the heck happened overnight? Shaq rubs his face, still half asleep, as he opens Twitter. The first thing he sees? Shaq the GOAT, trending worldwide. His mentions are flooded. Shaq is a legend. That dude. Jason should be ashamed. Faith in humanity restored. Shaq is what the world needs. This is what happens when you treat people like trash. Lesson learned. He scrolls down and sees the viral video. 1.7 million views overnight. The clip? Jason smirking, rejecting Shaq's money. Margaret looking defeated. Then Shaq pulling out a thick stack of cash, paying for everyone's meals like it was nothing. The moment the diner erupted in cheers. The comments, ruthless. Jason fumbled the biggest bag of his life. He really disrespected Shaq? Dude's lucky Shaq didn't dunk him over the counter. The way Shaq handled this was pure class, respect. Shaq chuckles, shaking his head. This wasn't just a viral moment, it was a movement, and people wanted justice. Public backlash begins. News outlets pick up the story fast. Shaq humiliates rude cashier and teaches a priceless lesson. CNN, NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal reminds us why kindness always wins. ABC News. Diner employee learns the hard way, never disrespect Shaq. TMZ, even celebrities jump in. LeBron James. Shaq stays setting the right example. That's leadership. Snoop Dogg. Some folks ain't got no home training. Props to the big homie Shaq. Ellen DeGeneres. This is how you use your influence for good. Love this. Shaq smirks, finally sitting up. He taps his phone, typing out a simple message. Kindness is free, but sometimes you gotta remind people. Within minutes, 100K likes, 50K retweets. Another round of media coverage. Shaq stretches, rolling his shoulders. He knew this was far from over, and he was right. Just as he stands up, his phone buzzes again. Kelly, diner manager, calling. He raises an eyebrow. That was fast. Shaq picks up. Morning, Kelly. Her voice is breathless, excited, almost frantic. Shaq, you won't believe what happened this morning. Shaq grins. Try me? Kelly pauses. Then she drops the bombshell. Jason just showed up at the diner, and he's asking for you. The morning air is crisp, but Jason barely notices. His stomach twists as he stands outside the diner, eyes locked on the sign taped to the glass door. Effective immediately, Jason is no longer an employee of this establishment. The words blur for a moment, his heart pounding. He knew this was coming. But actually seeing it? That hit different. Jason swallows hard, shoving his hands into his pockets. People pass by, some glancing at him, whispering. He can hear them. That's the guy who tried to humiliate an old woman. Shaq literally handed him a life lesson, and he fumbled it. Dude got himself fired over $12. Idiot! Jason clenches his jaw, his face burning. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was shame. For the first time, he wasn't mad at the world, He was mad at himself. He had brought this on himself. A sleek black car pulls up to the curb. Jason doesn't need to look up. He already knows who it is. The window rolls down slowly. Shaq's deep voice breaks the silence. You still think people get treated how they deserve? Jason tenses. He doesn't have a smart comeback this time. He turns, finally meeting Shaq's gaze. For the first time, there's no arrogance in his eyes. Just regret. He exhales, nodding. Number I don't. Shaq studies him for a moment, then nods toward the passenger seat. Get in. Jason hesitates. Why? Shaq smirks. Just get in, man. Jason doesn't argue. He slides into the seat, closing the door. They sit in silence for a moment. Finally, Shaq speaks. Tell me what you learned. Jason stares at his hands. I was a jerk. Shaq raises an eyebrow. That all? Jason sighs. I thought treating people differently based on money was normal. I thought that's just how the world works. Shaq shakes his head. And now? Jason swallows. Now I get it. I didn't just humiliate Margaret. I humiliated myself. Shaq leans back in his seat, nodding. Took you long enough? Jason lets out a small, humorless laugh. Then Shaq does something Jason never expected. He reaches into the glove compartment and pulls out a business card. He hands it to Jason. Jason reads it, eyes widening. St. Anthony's Homeless Shelter, volunteer coordinator. Go work there, Shaq says. Feed people. Meet people. Learn what struggling actually looks like. Jason grips the card, speechless. And then what? He finally asks. Shaq grins. Then we'll talk. Jason stares at the card, his mind racing. Shaq starts the car. Now go feed some people. Jason nods, stepping out. For the first time in years, he actually wants to be better. Jason's fingers tighten around the business card as he stares at it. The words St. Anthony's Homeless Shelter, volunteer coordinator, stare back at him, heavier than they should be. He messed up. Bad. And now, Shaq had just handed him an opportunity, a chance to make things right. But did he deserve it? Jason exhales sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. Man, I really screwed up, huh? Shaq leans back in his seat, arms crossed. Yeah, you did. Jason lets out a humorless chuckle. At least Shaq was honest. He looks at the card again, tracing the edges with his thumb. Why are you giving me a shot? Shaq tilts his head. Why do you think? Jason shifts uncomfortably. He wasn't used to second chances. His whole life, one mistake meant the end of an opportunity. You mess up a test, you fail, you screw up at work, you get fired, you act like a jerk to a basketball legend. The entire world sees it. But Shaq? Shaq wasn't laughing at him, wasn't mocking him. Instead, he was handing him a chance to be better. Jason swallows hard. You can't judge people just because they look broke. Shaq nods. And now you know that firsthand. Jason sighs. Yeah, I do. Shaq taps the steering wheel. So what are you going to do about it? Jason looks at the card again, heart pounding. He could ignore it, walk away, keep blaming the world for his mistakes. Or he could take responsibility. He clenches his jaw and nods firmly. I'll do it. Shaq smirks. Good, now don't just say it. Go do it. Jason looks at Shaq, then at the shelter's address on the card. He shoves it in his pocket. I will. Shaq studies him for a moment, then nods. Then we'll talk. Jason feels something he hasn't felt in years. Hope. Jason steps out of Shaq's car and watches as the engine rumbles to life. Shaq rolls down the window one last time. Now go feed some people. Jason stands there as Shaq drives away, the wind cool against his face. For the first time, he doesn't feel like a failure. For the first time, he knows. This isn't the end of his story. It's just the beginning. Jason turns, taking a deep breath. He starts walking toward the shelter. Margaret sits at a table near the window, slowly sipping her warm coffee. For the first time in a long time, she eats without stress. No counting pennies, no deciding which item to put back, no feeling like she doesn't belong, just peace. And for that, she has one person to thank. She glances up at Shaq, who sits across the diner, casually chatting with a few customers. The diner feels different now. The same place that had once made her feel small now felt welcoming. A new sign hangs near the register. No one leaves hungry. The manager, Kelly, had made it official. Anyone in need could now get a meal, no questions asked. And just a few feet away from Margaret, Jason stands behind the counter. But this time, he's not in charge. Jason adjusts his apron, glancing around the diner nervously. The same place where he once mocked a struggling woman was now the place where he was learning to serve others. Margaret watches as a young mother with two kids walks up to the counter. She looks hesitant, counting the few dollars in her hand. Jason takes a deep breath, then steps forward. "Don't worry about it," he says, his voice softer than before. "We got you covered." The woman's eyes widen. "Really?" Jason nods. "Yeah, no one leaves hungry here." Margaret smiles to herself. This wasn't the same Jason from before. Across the diner, Shaq watches the moment unfold. Kelly, the manager, leans over to him. "You really changed that kid's whole perspective." Shaq smirks. "Nah, he changed it himself." Kelly shakes her head in disbelief. "I still can't believe you gave him a second chance after all that." Shaq chuckles, taking a sip of his drink. "Sometimes people need to be reminded of what really matters. That kid thought respect came from money. Now, he's learning it comes from how you treat people." Kelly nods, watching Jason as he hands a meal to an elderly man with a smile. She exhales, shaking her head. "Well, whatever you did, it worked." Shaq simply grins. "That's how you treat people." The entire atmosphere in the diner has shifted. No more side-eyeing customers who struggle to pay. No more judging people based on their clothes. No more turning people away when they need help the most. Instead, customers pay it forward. If someone had extra, they left a little more. If someone was struggling, they got their meal covered. A place that was once cold and indifferent had become a place of kindness and community. Margaret takes the last sip of her coffee, feeling a sense of wholeness she hasn't felt in years. She stands up, walking over to Shaq. "I just wanted to say thank you." Shaq looks up at her and smiles warmly. "Ain't nothing to thank me for." She shakes her head. "Number there is. You didn't have to step in that night, but you did. And because of you, I didn't just get a meal. I got my dignity back." Shaq nods, his expression turning serious. "You never should have lost it in the first place." Margaret wipes a tear from the corner of her eye. "The world needs more people like you." Shaq chuckles, shaking his head. "Nah, the world just needs more kindness." Jason clears a nearby table, glancing over at Shaq. Their eyes meet. Shaq lifts his glass in a silent toast. Jason nods, understanding the message without a word. This was more than a lesson. This was a second chance at being a better person, and he wasn't going to waste it. You never know who's watching, so always choose kindness.